Hello everyone. So, I've talked about the Archie Sonic comics a few times on my channel, but I wanted to do this as a video on its own to explain the overall appeal of the series and why a lot of people like it, because I think there's some misconceptions about it. So the important thing to know about this series is that it's a different take on the Sonic world and its characters. It's not meant to be exactly like the games. Where the games were about stopping Eggman from taking over the world, the comics take place in a world where he already won, and the main heroes, the Freedom Fighters, are formed to take it back. My favorite thing to compare the series to is the original Teen Titans animated series, which was faithful to the heart of the comics and its characters while also giving its own spin on them. The Sonic comics, especially by the time Ian Flynn took over, also had a similar tone to that show, where some stories would be fun and comedic, and others would be very serious with little comedy, and then there would be ones that were a combination of both. So understand that this series is an alternate take on Sonic. It's not meant to be the games. I know that can be off-putting to someone who's only played the games, but it's okay if you don't like it. I'm not here to tell you how to feel, just to explain why things are the way they are in the series and why I and a lot of other people like it. So if you come away with your mind not changed, that's okay, but I appreciate you taking the time to hear me out. So to start off with, I'm going to explain why things are different in this series from the games. The simple reason is because when they began publishing it, they only had the first two games to go off of, so there were only 3 characters to work with and not much story. They had to create their own take on the Sonic world, so new characters like the Freedom Fighters were added to give a full cast and flesh the world out. Now, if you think the changes were disrespectful to the source material, Naoto Oshima has actually said before that he's a fan of the American version of Sonic, as shown in his tweets talking about Sad AM on screen now. Now, if you think it was wrong of America to give a different take on the series at all, you should know that Sonic's creation was actually a collaboration between Sega of Japan and Sega of America. I'll link a video in the description that goes in more detail, but Madeline Schroeder played a big part in how Sonic eventually turned out. So America having its own input on Sonic is not some awful thing. It goes back to the franchise's very origins. So on to the way the series handled the characters, starting with Sonic himself. The series maintained his fun-loving, happy-go-lucky, smart-aleck attitude, but also took the time to give him character development. Sometimes his carefree attitude causes problems, and he'll have to face the consequences of his actions and grow from those lessons. A great example of this would be in the story House of Cards, in which after Sonic had unintentionally hurt Tails, the two get into a fight. Now I know that sounds like something out of a bad fan fiction, but the fight was handled in a smart way. Keep in mind, Tails is a kid and looks up to Sonic more than anyone, so when Sonic did what he did and seemed to not care about it, it was devastating to the little guy. The fight also wasn't some overly dramatic, intense battle. It was just a little scuffle caused by a misunderstanding and had a satisfying ending. Sonic realizes what he did, apologizes to Tails, and the two repair their friendship. I thought that was some really interesting character stuff because it's something you wouldn't expect to happen with the two of them, and it happens in a logical way and then concludes in a logical way that has some actual character growth. That was actually one of the first stories I read from this series, and the way it was handled was part of what made me respect it so much. Now, moving on, Tails himself also had some really good character growth in this series. He really comes into his own over time instead of just always being the sidekick. You remember in Sonic Forces when Tails cowered in fear and called Sonic for help? Well, the Tails of this series would be ready to fight back on his own. The best example is in the story arc, The Tails Adventure, in which we see him able to strategize and fight on his own, all with a confident attitude. I'd honestly probably say Tails is my favorite character overall just because of how this series handled him. Now, the third character I want to talk about is a big one actually, Shadow. So, most people know Shadow as the edgelord of the Sonic series, and while he wasn't really that way when he was introduced, the games did drop the ball on him big time. His spin-off game is infamous for its overly dark and edgy tone, and I think really ruined his overall reputation, but the comics actually redeemed him from that. That's right, the Shadow the Hedgehog of the Archie comics is not an edgelord. He's a sympathetic former villain who genuinely changes and tries to be better. He actually shows remorse for his wrongdoings and does what he can to make up for them. Look at the picture on screen. That's not an edgelord smile, that's a genuine friendly smile. This is a real panel from the comics. Now, I'm not going to talk about 30 years later since I don't think that story was intended to be canon to the comics. It was kind of a weird what if possible future story. It was just kind of a weird one-off. So I'm just going to talk about Shadow in the main series. One of my favorite moments with him is when he tries convincing Metal Sonic to change his ways, saying that he doesn't have to be the weapon he was created to be, and when Metal refuses, Shadow's actually saddened and says, "I'm sorry it has to be this way." There's another story where he's working with some people who want to use the soul emeralds from Blaze the Cat's dimension, but if they use them, it'll destroy her world. We see Shadow being torn about what to do, and there's this great scene where he's trying to explain things to Blaze, and you could just see from his expression and the despair he has over what he's doing. But, in the end, he actually finds a way to make things work out for everyone, in a way that saves Blaze's world. So you could see the comics actually fixed Shadow's character and made him likable, not the joke of a character he's been made out to be over the series. I'd say that's worthy of praise on its own. So the next thing I want to talk about is the Freedom Fighters, who are a controversial part of this series, and that's something I find ridiculous. As I said before, they were created to flesh the series out and give it a regular cast, and they predate the majority of the game characters. The first Archie Sonic comic came out in 1992, just 1 year after the first game, so they go back to almost the very beginning of the franchise's inception. Now, some people might say that they're products of the past and that people only like them because they grew up on them, but I'm proof that that's just not true. I didn't grow up on Sonic at all, and in fact only got into the series a year ago, and I'm a fan of the Freedom Fighters. I'd never played the games as a kid aside from a demo of Sonic Heroes, but I took an interest last year and found them fun. The thing is, though, I didn't really get into the story or the characters, I just found the gameplay fun. But when I started to read these comics, that's when my attitude toward the Sonic franchise began to change, and I started to really care about it. To me, the Freedom Fighters aren't just those characters from the comics in that one cartoon, they're characters like any other in the franchise. I developed a fondness for them not because of my childhood, but because I just like what I was reading in the comics. I like Sally because of her leadership abilities. She was a princess who had to grow up quickly and learn how to lead a team once Robotnik or Eggman took over her home. I also like how she plays off the other characters, mainly Sonic. Yes, I know there was the one dumb story where she hit him, but that was an out-of-character moment. She was under stress and had a breakdown. It could have been handled better, but one bit of bad writing doesn't ruin a whole character for me. If that were the case, I'd hate Spider-Man because of One More Day. A story in which he makes a deal with the devil. It's Mephisto, but it's still the devil. It's really dumb and I hate it, but I still love Spider-Man. So moving on, I like Antoine because of how he grew as a character over time. He started out a coward, but gained confidence and became able to handle situations better. He still has fears, but as the series goes on, he really learns how to overcome them and help his friends out in a fight. I like Bunny because of her spunky attitude and how it plays off the other characters, and I think it's an interesting concept to have a hero character who's half roboticized. I could keep going on about characters in the series, but to save time I'm only going to talk about two more. Now, these two I will say might be annoying for new readers, they were for me. Just so you know, these comics aren't perfect. No series really is, but the negatives don't outweigh the positives for me. This first character is not as bad, and actually grew on me over time, Fiona Fox. I have a whole video on her, but basically she was a hero turned villain. At first, she didn't make any sense to me, and the change came off as just done for drama. But I started rethinking her motivations and what led up to her change, and I actually realized it could work. If she'd had a redemption story to complete her arc. I explain it in more detail in the video, but I think the reason Fiona changed was just because of a misunderstanding about life that could have easily been fixed. But there's no possibility of it happening because she was removed from the series due to a lawsuit over character rights. She was removed because of her connection to the next character I'm going to talk about, Scourge the Hedgehog. I know exactly what this looks like. It looks like original the character Do Not Steal recolor. I know, that threw me off the first time I read the series too, but I actually think he's supposed to be an homage to a concept from Star Trek. If you've never seen Star Trek, there was an episode of the original series called Mirror Mirror, which introduced a mirror universe where everyone's evil. You might know this as the episode with Spock having a goatee. Scourge is basically the same idea. He's evil Sonic from another universe where everything is reversed. I think the reason they made him green was to differentiate him visually from Sonic. It's just unfortunate Sonic recolors are infamous on the internet. I wouldn't blame you for being put off by that, but all I can say is, if you read the series, just remember it's not supposed to be the whole OC thing. I think it's more a nod to that whole mirror universe concept from Star Trek. And I mean, evil versions of characters is kind of a trope in fiction anyway. So that's pretty much everything I have to say. Gave you some negatives and positives. I told you about how the series, handled some of the game characters a lot better, fleshing them out more, like Sonic and Tails, and especially Shadow, just completely redeeming that whole character. And, my reasoning for why I like the Freedom Fighters, why a lot of people like them, why they were created in the first place, and why they should really be kept around. I don't think that they should be forced into the games all of a sudden and have the story reworked to fit them in, but they should be kept around in some form. They're a part of the Sonic franchise, and they're a big part of it. They were the supporting cast of the series before a majority of the game's supporting cast was even created. And over the time of the comics being written, were expanded on and fleshed out a lot over the almost 25-year period that the series ran. So, yeah, if you want to check the series out, I recommend starting at around issue 160. The early stuff is mostly comedy-focused, and the period of time before Ian Flynn takes over is kind of a weird and experimental one. I like to think of that time period as being like the Silver Age for these comics. And if you know anything especially about DC in the Silver Age, you know what I'm talking about being experimental. But yeah, I'd say start with the later stuff to kind of get eased in to this different take on the Sonic world, if you're a game-only fan, and get a little bit more comfortable with it if you want to try it out. And again, if you weren't really into this and this didn't change your mind, that's completely okay. I just hope that this helped you to understand why, this series is so loved by a lot of people, and a lot of the really good things that it did do. So yeah, thanks for watching, and please share this video around. I'd very much appreciate it. So yeah, have a nice day, and see you next time.